the same people and it's highly competitive. And how have you seen any strategies for how can you be creative in your sourcing to find people who might not be so competitive but are equally talented?
I think being able to find people who are non-obvious on paper, but then become obvious throughout your interview process is a real advantage. It's also really hard. And so I think there's like no kind of single path that makes it work. Some things we've seen people do that have worked for them is in some cases just looking through GitHub and basically clicking through contributors to open source projects. In other cases, the Twitter strategy sometimes goes in that direction because even if it's a Twitter profile you recognize, it might not be like a LinkedIn profile that you would click into. I think there's often a lot of indexing, especially amongst founders for colleges. And a lot of great talent may not have gone to a great college, especially from like your competitive advantage perspective. If they went to a good university and worked at a good company, they're going to get a lot of outreach anyways. If they've maybe only done one of those two things, they might still be really talented and they might not be getting as much outreach.
When people ask me sort of why Juicebox has got so much traction, I essentially reply it's because the product just works. I don't think I have a better answer. I've always been curious, like, why is it so difficult to make the product work? What's actually so hard about when I type in, I want a software engineer with 10 years of experience? Why is it so hard to surface like the relevant candidate, and how have you been able to do that?
A little bit of context on Juicebox. We do search, contact management, outreach, and then sync all of that data with your ATS. And of those, search is really the hardest part. And so being able to find the right person is a hard problem for two reasons. One, there's a long tail of different search queries. And so if people are using the platform correctly, no one will have exactly the same search query because there's always something unique about the role or unique about the opportunity. That also means that there's a long tail of potential filters we might need or potential ways to think through how we filter a segment of search. And then that relates to the depth of a profile. So if someone has previous experiences, those are really important in a search result. And it's also quite different than how search on like a sales tool might work, where it's all about the current company or the current role. With recruiting, it's really about their full depth of experience. And so I guess long-winded way of saying that search is really important and is usually what drives those outcomes.
And so I guess to get the most out of a tool like Juicebox, how detailed should my search be? Like, it's almost like I'm prompting Juicebox. So like, am I trying to write like a full system prompt here, or like give us like a sense of what I should be doing?
I think the easiest way to learn is kind of by starting with what feels natural. That might be a couple sentences about the role. And then Juicebox gives you a few different ways to filter further. And so we have a feature called Autopilot, which is personally my favorite feature in the platform. It lets you define criteria, and then you'll get a check mark for every profile who matches that criteria. Criteria can be super specific, like has published a paper in at least 2 peer-reviewed journals, something that doesn't exist as a filter otherwise. And you can write your own, you'll get check marks for everyone who matches that, and then continue customizing from there. And so I'd start with like a fairly broad initial prompt, maybe a couple sentences, and then as you fine tune it and get more narrow, adding additional criteria.
That makes sense. And then the more criteria you have, the more like material you have to personalize the outreach message to those candidates.
Exactly. And you can even create like different groups of candidates that you might do similar personalization for. So maybe like academic outreach, open source outreach, etc., which can be a good way at like personalizing at scale.
When it comes to sort of like the channels sort of outreach, we have different channels. Should I be trying to contact the same candidate through every channel, or should I be focusing on one channel? And do certain channels tend to have better response rates than others?
Ideally, yes, we'd reach out to every candidate on every channel. Practically, it becomes difficult and quite time consuming. I'd say the default should always be email because it's what you can automate and get real data on. What are your reply rates, open rates, and more. If you're just sending a single message, your best response rate is probably going to be on, I guess apart from like a Twitter, it's probably going to be on LinkedIn. But the advantage of email is that you're not just sending a single message. Instead, you're orchestrating this multi-step campaign. And so with those multiple steps, you're going to get a better response rate on email than you would with a single message on a LinkedIn. And so I think the easiest way to get started is just email automation, improving your response rates by adding in a LinkedIn step. And then if you want to get creative beyond that is when you can start layering in the other channels.
Is your answer different for engineers versus AEs?
Good sellers are often particularly active on LinkedIn because they're also communicating with their prospects there. And so response rates tend to be higher there. For engineering, in the comparisons we've seen customers do, oftentimes emails get better response rates instead.
For referrals, you mentioned referrals, great source of early hires. Once I've got my team to identify a list of potential referral candidates, who should do the reach out?
Ideally, you as the founder. In general, I think the more senior the person reaching out, the better the response rate is going to be. And so ideally, all outreach always comes from the founders. A lot of systems will also let you set sender email is different from the person operating it. And so if, for example, you have a recruiter on your team who's doing outreach on behalf of the founder, can be a good scalable high impact strategy too.
Often the first thing the candidates will see when they look up the company is like the job description. And are there any things I can do to make the job descriptions unique or stand out?
I think the bar for job descriptions is pretty low. A lot of job descriptions are very wordy, kind of sound corporate, maybe ChatGPT written. And if your job description is not that, that's already a big advantage over others. I'd say the other part that generally trends one way is job descriptions are often long. They're kind of hard to read, and most applicants are probably not going to read the whole thing. And so if you keep it short, a few bullets of what really matters to you and what encompasses the role can be quite impactful. And the only other advice I'd have is that oftentimes kind of goes back to the selling thing. People forget to sell the company in the job description. And so that should be at least 30%, maybe more of the job description is why is this a great place to work, and what would that involve for you?
Often companies, when they're describing themselves in their job description or even on their website, it's almost like they want to cast as wide of a net as possible. They want to be attractive to everyone. And as a result, it comes across as very bland. It's like just the same set of values on every single job description. I wish companies would actually be more opinionated at times, like say what they will trade off. Like, hey, we value collaboration, which means you might not we value that more than just autonomy, just as like one example. What do you think? Is it better to cast a wide net, or should you try and be opinionated, and how much?
Opinionated is great. I think it also shows the character of the founders and like the culture of the team. That can be one of your main selling points as well. It's like you're joining the team for the culture and for that opinionated selling point. And so I don't know if I've seen an example of something that's too opinionated. So probably leaning as far there as possible.
Yeah, because I think it's the point that you made in your talk too, is that you care about like the interested rate, not just the raw reply rate. And so like it's better to have a smaller number of applications, but from highly interested people that are likely to convert, than just a bunch of generic applications.
Yes, yeah, and the kind of value per interested response, you'll see depending on the role, it can be like maybe 20 interested responses gets you to hire, maybe 5 interested responses gets you to hire. And so even that like relative value can change quite a lot.
As it gets towards more of you've identified someone you want, you've interviewed them, you want to hire them. You mentioned a lot about sort of convincing them to join you over a bigger company. How hard should you try actually to convince someone? And when do you know if maybe you're trying too hard?
It's again a little bit like enterprise sales, like knowing what does the candidate, or in the sales comparison, the prospect actually want, what are they really looking for? And you might get signals early on that they really want to be in big tech, and that can be really hard to convince them otherwise, especially if it's like, say,